that I do from time to time. And I went through and while I was preparing for this lesson, I found some of these church signs. And I kind of cringe when I see these. And I think you can figure out why. Because this is the kind of thing that critics of Christianity, critics of the Bible like to get a hold of. Reason is the greatest enemy that faith has. So just stop and let that sink in and process it for a minute. And think about how that would be interpreted. Oh, Christians can't be reasonable. They can't use thought. They can't use reason because of their faith. And this is why I think so many people, if you look at Webster's dictionary, it says that faith is something believed without evidence. And this is the kind of thing that makes people think that as Christians we don't think about evidence, we don't think about proof for our faith. But Hebrews chapter 11, when he talks about faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the substance of things not seen, that word for substance actually has this, it's not the same word, but it is the root where we get our word hypothesis. And hypothesis has got evidence to back it up. Here's another one. If your faith is big enough, facts don't count. Not to mention there's at least grammatical punctuation thing. Turn off your brain, or turn your brain off, let the Spirit take over. Now that one there, Christians, when you come in, you must check your brain at the door, or not think. And then the more educated we become, the farthest we move away from God. There is, I think, some truth to that. I've known some people who studied their way into apostasy because they didn't stop to think, they didn't reason some things out. See, the message is clear that the church is the kind of place where you have to check your brain. And independent thought is a lot of times discouraged. Now, you know that I have always said, no, you need to think for yourself. You need to study this for yourself and not just take my word for it. Here's another one. Don't be so open-minded that your brains fall out. I like this one. I like this one. I like it for people to understand where our brains have got to be functioning. And then this one. This is one that trips a lot of people up. Now notice free thinking is one word in this instance. And atheist author Adam Lee defines free thought as thinking which is independent of revelation, tradition, established belief, and authority, considers it as a broader umbrella than atheism, that embraces a rainbow of unorthodoxy, religious dissent, skepticism, and unconventional thinking. The classic definition of free thinking it was pretty much equated with atheism. And if you were a free thinker, it meant you were free from what they considered religious superstition. And then a person who has formed their own opinions using, this is a free thinker, it's a person who's formed their own opinion using reason and rational inquiry, somebody who has rejected dogma, especially with regard to religion. Now notice all these definitions basically pit religion against reason. That is, if you are a religious person, you don't use reason. That your thought process is not something that is reasonable, that is level-headed, that is anything that's going to be fact-based. And then regarding religion, free thinkers typically hold that there is insufficient evidence to support the existence of supernatural phenomena. According to the Freedom from Religion Foundation, no one can be a free thinker who demands conformity to a Bible, creed, or Messiah. But notice they demand conformity to their version of free thinking. To the free thinker, revelation and faith are invalid, and orthodoxy is no guarantee of truth. And free thinkers are convinced that religious claims have not withstood the tests of reason. Not only is there nothing to be gained by believing an untruth, can't argue with that really, there is nothing to be gained by believing an untruth or a lie, but there is everything to lose when we sacrifice the indispensable tool of reason on the altar of superstition. Most free thinkers consider religion to be not only untrue, but harmful. I would say that they're right to an extent. I consider atheism to be pretty harmful. Atheism in less than 100 years has managed to kill over 100 million people throughout Europe and throughout Asia through communism. And Christianity, we got a lot of Christians who've done some bad things too. There's no argument there. But when you get right down to it, everybody has got some kind of spiritual or religious beliefs, just like we all have some kind of political beliefs. And so either one of those is going to dictate to the other, by the way, and overshadow the other, by the way. But when it comes to free thinkers consider religion to be not only untrue but harmful, we got to stop and take a look at what the evidence shows us. Now, I believe that there's enough evidence to show us that Christianity is what it claims to be. And I find that a lot of people in this modern time who reject it, they haven't really investigated it. There are some exceptions. But I want us, over this series, I want us to think about how Christianity is illogical, it is reasonable, it is something that we can have some evidence that it is true, and we can think critically, and we can analyze things. Now, in their book about the life and epistles of St. Paul, I can talk, really I can. The Greek religion, they said, was a mere deification of human attributes and the power of nature. It was a religion which ministered to art and amusement, was entirely destitute of moral power. In other words, the Greek myths spoke of gods and goddesses that in their own rivalries and ambitions acted more like humans than gods. And there were plenty of deities to choose from. There was a joke told in Athens, it was easier to find a god than a man. Now give it some thought. Think about the gods they have. They fight with each other. There's myths and legends of them killing each other, having children with each other, their children rebelling. That sounds an awful lot like humans. Now compare that to the God of the Bible, who says, first of all, you're not going to have any other gods before me. Ixnay on the statues and on the graven images. And you notice that God, if you look at, for instance, the most obvious example, Exodus, where these dealing with the Egyptian gods, Moses, when he wrote that book, he understood Egyptian theology. He understood how those Egyptian gods function, and understood how each of those plagues, for instance, was an attack on one of their gods, and notice which god came out on top. So there's a big difference between the God of the Bible and the gods of the Egyptians or the Greeks or whoever. They are not the same. There's a big difference. And in Athens, is what's left of the Acropolis. In Paul's day, though, all this was associated with their religion. The city was so devoted to the philosophy that when Paul got there, of course, he's doing some sightseeing, they were wanting to hear something new. They just loved to do that. Kind of reminded me of sometimes you see this in the old movies, maybe in Mayberry on the Andy Griffith Show or something. They go to the general store and you got two old guys sitting out there playing checkers, or they're just watching people go by, and then they're just waiting to hear some new news come by. That's basically what happened here on Mars Hill, where Paul is meeting these people. So I want us to go look at this idea of not checking our brains. It's use our brains and think. And here's how Paul shows us how it's done. First of all, notice when he got up there on Mars Hill, he debated, but he didn't berate them. He didn't rebuke them, scold them, or chide them, which is the definition of berate. You notice he just met them on their own turf and met them with a logical presentation of the gospel. A logical presentation about who this unknown God is. And like any good teacher, he tailored his presentation to the audience. Any of you who've taught before, you know that not every class is going to be exactly the same. Not every student is exactly the same. The idea of one size fits all, it doesn't work. There's always, you're going to run into somebody whose size doesn't fit whatever you've got. An example of this that I thought of was when we worked in a couple of group homes, and there was one congregation that really supported one of the homes that we worked in. They were big supporters of it. And about once a year, we would load the kids up on Sunday afternoon. We'd go up to Oklahoma City and worship there with this congregation. They would have a meal afterwards, and it was just a good time to get together. Well, this particular Sunday, we went up there, and we've got 45, 50 kids, I think, coming from the home. We got up there, and I don't think it was their regular preacher. I think it was an associate that was speaking that night. He was an older guy. Keep in mind, this is a while ago. I was saying that's old necessarily anymore, but back in the day. And I remember he was preaching out of Hebrews. But he didn't think about his audience that night. His talk, I just remember thinking, was really not even something that I would have presented to a congregation. It was more like a college lecture. Very technical. Got into a lot of the Greek and this, and that, and the other, and grammar. And you could look around and see he lost the kids in about 5 minutes. He didn't think, I'm going to have these kids who are not normal churchgoers, by the way. Know little to nothing about the Bible. Maybe we need to tailor it for this special audience and this occasion. Paul, you can see, did that. He tailored what he was going to say. Jesus did the same thing. Tailored what they were going to say to their audience. And that's what any good teacher or speaker needs to do. And then Luke wrote that Paul went to the synagogue to debate. He's there to have this discussion. Paul knows that once he starts talking, he's going to get somebody who's going to question him. He's going to have a little pushback. He knows it. But he's prepared. And that's the same thing we're going to get. I welcome the questions. Now, I never promise to have all the answers to all the questions. But I do promise to help find those answers. But we all have to be ready with those answers. Paul is discussing, he's listening, and firmly stating his convictions. He's thinking, he's talking, and giving thoughtful responses to the questions that he gets. He's not just giving them canned answers that he picked up in Sunday school and has just carried with him. These are thought-out, research answers where he's learned from his days at the feet of Gamaliel and then since then. And in Galatians chapter 1 and 2, we know that he, after his conversion, he consulted with the apostles and made sure that they were on the same page, that he was preaching the same thing that they were preaching. And everything checked out. He preached the exact same thing that the other apostles who had been with Jesus since the days of his ministry were preaching. And so discussing, he's listening, he's not backing down, he's holding his own, and he's presenting the gospel. He's not doing what you see in this picture. He's not getting in people's faces, he's giving them a chance to talk, and he's effectively presenting the gospel, so we don't have to yell and belittle. In fact, if you start doing that, that's a good indication that you're pretty insecure in your position, that you don't have a basis for your argument, or you have a weak basis for it. But we've got a firm foundation we can stand on. We've just got to know the foundation ourselves. So Paul's going to make a point of distinguishing God from the idolatry and the philosophers of the culture. These people have got many gods. And just in case they missed one, there's this altar over here to the unknown God. They don't want to leave anybody left out. If anybody would feel left out, they don't want to offend anybody. All right, so let's make this altar to the unknown God. And in fact, I have found that there are some other societies and cultures that had statues to the unknown gods too. The Greeks weren't the only ones. There are a lot of polytheistic cultures out there. That's one thing that makes Christianity and Islam and Judaism unique, is they're the only monotheistic religions in the world. The rest of them are all polytheistic. Athens was an intellectual center. They're always listening and looking for new ideas. They're always looking for something new. That song Vince Gill did many years ago. Everybody's looking for the next big thing. That's Athens. They're looking for the next big idea, the next new thing. And their attitude towards religion is kind of what you see today. Whatever suits you. Whatever you want to do. That's fine. Live and let live. Just, you go do, you be you and I'll do me. Yeah, that's really, that religion thing is really not mine. But if it works for you, hey, go for it. Which can be good. That was kind of the attitude I was raised with. So when I started searching for it, reading the scriptures and reading the Bible, I didn't have all the prejudices, all the, our church says X, Y, or Z, and you shouldn't do this or do that. I didn't have a lot of that. So that can be good if you've got a sort of attitude of just whatever suits you. On the other hand, that can work against us if you've got someone who's not going to accept biblical authority. But if they'll accept biblical authority, then we should be able to present and to teach them the gospel. Colossians chapter 2, the problem with so many philosophies is they are based on subjective standards and human tradition. And that's one of the things that when someone rejects the Bible, rejects Christianity, but they still think that, I mean, you can be a moral person without it. But here's the problem. What are you basing your authority on? So if I'm an atheist and I believe I'm a moral person, I believe that stealing is wrong, murder is wrong, okay, that's great, but what are you basing that on? I'm basing it on the Scripture, what God has told me, but what are you going to base it on if you're a non-believer? Because it just is? Well, okay, but that's kind of subjective. What are you going to base it on then? There's a subjective standard, there's human tradition. That gets in. Here's Colossians 2. Here's the text. Beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and be deceived, according to the tradition of men, according to the basic principles of the world, and not according to Christ, for in him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily. Now, tradition is not necessarily bad, but it can be bad if it gets in the way of biblical teaching. If it becomes the standard equal to, if you put it on, equal to or greater than Scripture, that's a problem. So, for all the Athenians and the foreigners who are there, they spent their time in nothing else but to tell them, here's something new. They just wanted to hear the latest idea, the latest gossip, looking for the next big thing. They were kind of tired of that idea. Anybody got a new one? Well, there's this guy over here. Yeah, what's he saying? That's something about a resurrection. What's that all about? I don't know. Let's go over and ask him. And that's how they got into the discussion with Paul. Then Paul is going to appeal to reason. If you look at what he says here, he's not preaching about some pie-in-the-sky, bearded old man sitting there. He's using logic. He is building a reasonable case. Look at verse 27. He explains that God made every nation from one man to inhabit the earth, so that what? We would see God. We've got a built-in, humans have got a built-in, some call it the God hole, God-shaped hole that only God can fill. But we've got that inner desire for something, that spiritual side of us, that's going to see God. Now, some will try to fill it with things besides God. This is why people have problems with alcohol. They become workaholics. They get into drugs, they get into other things because they're trying to fill that spiritual side with something that it's not going to work unless it's God, unless it's the Lord. They'll find God, reach for God, find God. He's not far from us. It's not that hard. We just have to set aside ourselves, take ourselves off the throne, and submit ourselves to what the Lord wants. Paul states some reasons here for our arguments to believe in the God of the Bible. Number one, he's the creator of the universe. God made everything. It's reasonable to conclude that the universe had a creation and a creator, that it had a beginning. All that's very reasonable to conclude. And there's a book out by Norm Geisler and Frank Turkle. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Because if you think about it, the universe had to have come from somewhere, and to be an atheist and have believe that, you got to believe it popped up out of nowhere. Or maybe that it's always existed, or self-created somehow. But there's no way that with no laws of science we know it that could cause that. Secondly, God is the sustainer of life. It's at His hands that we have everything that we need. He created the seasons, the growing seasons, gave us what we have to sustain us. He gave us the right atmosphere, the right alignment and the blend, everything we need to sustain ourselves. And then God is the ruler of the nations. That's also the theme of the book of Daniel. God rules the nations. And Daniel, and in fact Nebuchadnezzar even admitted that. One of the most politically powerful men on earth at the time, probably the most powerful, and yet he eventually came to recognize that Daniel's God, the God of Israel, really rules the nations. And then God is the Father of human beings. In one sense, He's the Father of everybody. He created us. On the other, on a more intimate set, He is the Father of Christians in the spiritual sense. In that we have accepted His gift of salvation. We are following Jesus, following His Son, trying to anyway. And so in that sense, He's the Father of us. He's the ruler, sustainer, and creator. And then Paul presents Christianity as logical and reasonable. The Bible gives us an objective standard for right and wrong. Now remember, when you look at the Old Testament, and you look at a lot of the stuff there, remember, there is a record being made. It doesn't mean that everything is approved of. gets lost a lot of the time. For instance, David and Bathsheba. I don't see anywhere in there where God said he approved of that. But I do see where it's recorded. It happened. But then God also gave David a punishment. His son that he had, the first child he and Bathsheba had died. And there was a price to be paid for it. That's where the 51st Psalm got written. So, just because it's recorded doesn't necessarily mean that there's approval of it. And in Acts 17 and Romans 1, we see appeals to natural revelation. There is a creator. Or, got it backwards. There is a creation. Therefore, there's got to be a creator. There's a building here. Therefore, there was someone somewhere who designed it, and there was a crew that built it. Your car. I'd rather doubt your car just popped up out of the ground in the driveway one day. Someone somewhere designed it. Someone put it together. Someone shipped it to the dealership where you bought it, or somebody bought it, and you bought it from them. But it didn't just appear out of thin air. It was created. It was invented. It was designed to do what it did. We are designed to do what it is we do. Look at back in verse 24. God who made the world and everything in it. Lord of heaven and earth does not dwell in temples made with hands. Nor is he worshipped with man's hands as though he needed anything. Since he gives all life, breath, and all things. What can we give the creator of the universe that he doesn't already have? And notice that he does not dwell in temples made with hands. I know we like to call buildings like this, I'm going over to the church. Well, no, it's or the house of, you're in the Lord's house. Well, no, it's a building that we use for worship, yes. But God doesn't reside here in the sense that like he did in the temple. This is the church building, the church facility, the church meeting place where we all come together. But God, we don't have to meet in a designated holy place anymore. We don't have to go to Jerusalem anymore. We can gather anywhere, in any structure or no structure, and still be worshiping God. He is not worshipped with man's hands. We don't build idols. We don't need to build statues and things like that. In fact, remember, Old Testament God said, don't do it. Do not build those graven images. And so Paul's appealing to his audience with reason and with thought. These are people that are wanting, they're intellectual. They're wanting to be challenged. They're wanting to think. And so Paul is doing that. He's meeting among their own grounds. Uses their language. Even quoted their poets. And trying to reach them with terms they would understand. It's critical to remember. To put things in terms that your audience or your student or your class can understand. I one time quoted somebody in a discussion. It was a comedian that I quoted, who's also an atheist, and oh wait, he's an atheist, why are you quoting him? I said, hey, Paul quoted pagan philosophers, and you notice he didn't get struck down. So I think we're okay. We can quote people to make the point, to illustrate what we're trying to learn, just to make sure the quote is something that is appropriate for your audience. And he did not compromise Christian principles. That is key, especially today when there's so much pressure to compromise the gospel message. Don't compromise it. It is what it is. It says what it says. And we cannot compromise it. We can't change it. God did not give us that authority. And then he explains the unknown God with a reason and a logical approach. And I noticed something. The New King James says the altar was to the unknown God. And I had to check the language on this because I didn't notice it until I saw it on the screen. But the NIV says to an unknown God. I'm not sure if one of those is more correct than the other. But the idea is that they had a God that they wanted to make sure, or in case there was a God up there, they wanted to make sure they didn't miss him. They didn't want to offend him. I even found an altar with this inscription, to the unknown God. So let me tell you about this unknown God. You're worshiping him without knowing him, but let me help you out here. Let me tell you about it. I had a friend who once did, I think he was in Prague, he was in Europe somewhere, pretty sure it was Prague, and he did just basically what Paul did. He was with a street corner preacher, and they weren't really getting anywhere, and he realized, number one, his partner wasn't speaking the language really well. 2, he wasn't using anything that his audience would. He was in an old European city with a unique architecture, and so he started using the architecture and the buildings and the creation of those and how nice they were. And now let's talk about how God created us just like these buildings were created by somebody. Long story made short. So Paul is assuming here as a truth that there is a God who made the world. And that's where we have to start as a first truth. There's a God out there. And that's really what Genesis does. In the beginning, God created. Just assuming the existence of God as a first truth. And then Paul further argues that this God could not be confined to a temple. And that this God, the gods that they're worshiping rather, are confined to the temples, and so they could not be the supreme God. If you have to come to this temple to worship Zeus or Hercules or pick your God, if this is where you're going to do it, and he's confined to this temple, how can he be a supreme God? How can he be the creator of the universe if he's got to stay in this temple that you created? But God, because he is the creator of everything, he's outside of time, space, and matter. And the Greek word here for worship is to serve, to wait upon. So a couple of meanings here that Paul might have. Number one is referring to the notion among the pagans that gods were fed or nourished by offerings made to them. In some cultures, I think this still happens, where they'll leave food at the base of statues, where their god, usually the birds or whatever, gets it. And so they would bring things for their gods, and while Corinthians talks about them being off in the marketplace, sometimes being offered to gods, various gods. And then you might also be referring to people who are employed in the temples to serve gods, kind of the keepers of the temple, the ones who made sure that things for the gods were ready for their various services and ceremonies and what have you, preparing the sacrifices and that sort of thing. So the idea that's prevalent among them, and I think it's still prevalent in some primitive cultures today, that taking care of the God, much like we take care of people. So he's affirming the creator of things cannot be dependent on his creatures. God is not dependent on us for his supper. He's not dependent on us for anything. We're dependent on him. And so the course of worship that they offer in their temples is pretty absurd for the God of creation, for the God of the universe. So we can see Christianity as logical, it's reasonable. You don't have to turn off your brain to believe. And notice the responses that Paul got there on Mars Hill. One was to reject it. Oh yeah, they sneered. Yeah, right. This guy, that's not anything that I want to get into. Some of them, wanted some more information. Well, here you again on this matter. And then some received it, verse 34. A few men believed and joined Paul. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yeah, that makes sense, Paul. Tell me more. What do I need to do? And so you've got to make a decision. Which one will you do? Reject it, want more information, or accept it? Be immersed, be baptized, and have your sins forgiven, as they were told in Acts chapter 2, and all the conversions we see recorded in the book of Acts. Be immersed and raised to walk that new life. Or if you need more information, that's fine. We can study it. We'll talk about it. And if you are a Christian, and we talked a little about this today in the adult Sunday school class, you're struggling,